Everyone. Welcome to the Forum for Global Studies latest podcast. I'm Dr. Sandeep Tripathi, founder of Forum for Global Studies. As we know that day before yesterday and Saturday, a major geopolitical crisis has taken place in Russia. And that has a deeper repercussions, implications on geopolitics. And lots of questions emerge that what are the factors and how did Kremlin's insiders, a very close confidant of Putin, turn as a rebellion. So lots of questions today we have on this topic. Today we have with us Smita Sharma. She is a leading journalist, TV commentator, columnist, and visiting faculty at the Cortella School of Public Policy. So thank you so much for joining here. I really welcome you to accept our invitation. And let me start some questions. So the first question to you, Smita, being a Kremlin insider, Prigozhin, how do you see? Is it the first ever challenge to the legitimacy of Putin's long-standing regime?
Hi, Dr. Tripathi. Thank you so much for having me here. And, right at the outset, let me put out a few disclaimers for all the listeners and viewers of your podcast, because while I have been a journalist writing and focusing on foreign policy for a long time, but I'm no Russia expert per se. So I will be speaking more from the realm of a journalist who is reading, who's picking up information, who's not on the ground herself. And the information access is very, very restricted actually for the entire world community, keeping in mind that over the last few years, in fact, President Putin has tightened his grip so much over media, over any sort of a press information that is going out. Journalists have been, threatened. They have been forced to leave the country. We've seen journalists charged with espionage charges, in fact. So keeping that in mind, and add to the fact that there is a huge disinformation propaganda war that is going on online at the moment with multiple stakeholders. So if you are on Twitter and Twitter knows that you are interested in foreign policy, I'm sure your Twitter feed is filled with algorithm-driven tweets, but most of which, if you go ahead and take a look at the backgrounds, they will be either Ukrainian voices or pro-Ukrainian voices or anti-Russian voices whose tweets are popping up. So having said that, coming to your question, you of course have been a very, very close follower of events in Russia yourself, and you would know better than a lot of other people that I think in the almost 23 years plus and counting sort of regime of President Putin, the one thing he knows very well, he has perfected, that is the art of political stability. I don't think that this is the first real challenge to his legitimacy. Of course, he has come up the ranks as an intelligence official, then as a leader from the days of Boris Yeltsin till now. Last year, we saw a lot of images of protests coming out, especially since the Ukraine war. There have been these constant predictions that this is a miscalculation, that this will take Mr. Putin down, that he won't be able to survive, because it was also very contrary to what he had promised when he came into power, when he first won the presidential elections. And he's had, if you go back to his speeches that he has made over the years, his statements, it's very clear. He wanted this big, sort of vision that, of course, he couldn't return to the pre-Cold War era, that the world wouldn't become a bipolar rival force. But at the same time, Russia wanted to drive the vision of Eurasia. Russia wanted to be that driver. And he promised that he would amend the broken economy of Russia. So, in the initial years when he was making the right noises, and then you fast forward it and come to now, and in the wake of the Ukrainian war, that was, a body blow, of course, in a lot of way to the Russian economy, which had started to stagger, which was crumbling, which was decaying. A lot of its military outfits, military units, military, in fact, hardware, which is its prime source of export to the world, that has not come out in great light when you look at those images from Ukraine. So keeping that in mind, when you look at this mutiny, as it is being called, or a coup d'etat that is being called, there are a lot of WhatsApp theories or Twitter theories that are doing the rounds. And the strands of information are divided basically into 2-3 camps. One that says that Putin is completely doomed after this, that this is going to be the beginning of his end. The other conspiracy theory that says that perhaps it was Putin himself who played a role behind the scenes in trying to stage this entire mutiny. Now, that I do find a bit far-fetched, because at the end of the day, there are serious questions, and we can take this forward in our conversation, that have arisen about his control on Russia. But I do think that this has combined with the Ukrainian war, combined with the fact that there has been so much of Western economic sanctions and pressures, this definitely has created a moment where it may lead to some sort of a change, not immediately, but of course in the weeks and months to come, especially in the run up to the presidential elections in Russia.
Thank you so much for these insights. And I think the same questions related to your answer, how is it possible for Putin? How is it easy for Putin to manage this crisis? Just because we have seen that Prigozhin is not just like Navalny. And there are some sections in the scholars that they argue that the entire episode is just Western sponsored and the Western managed. But I, as a Russian expert, I do not see as there is comparison between the Prigozhin and the Navalny. Just because he was the Prigozhin who fought for the sovereignty, the Russian sovereignty in the Bakhmut battle, and we have seen that he won the Bakhmut battle and he fought for the Russian territory, Russian sovereignty. So, and that is why there is a sense of attachment and a sense of nationalistic hero icon in the Russian mass, despite having some allegations. And I am not going to his background about the previous background, but today's at a time when Prigozhin has a legitimacy now within the Russian mass, is it easy for Putin to manage the way he managed with the help of Alexander Lukashenko?
There are a couple of things. I mean, the one thing that I slightly disagree with you is that you spoke about sort of the nationalist feeling. And it is important to keep in mind Prigozhin's background, because, he has risen from serious allegations. I mean, he went to prison way back in 1981 as a 20-year-old boy. And on charges of serious fraud, on charges of serious corruption. He served prison time for a couple of years. When he came out in the early 90s, that's when he started selling hot dogs. He built his own restaurant business, catering business, ran the chain of companies. He even started catering to, of course, once he became very close and became known as the chef of Putin, he started catering to world leaders. He has catered to world leaders, including the likes of a George H.W. Bush, to, of course, a Jacques Chirac. But once he got into this business of fighting for money, he's a mercenary at the end of the day. The Wagner PMC, or the private military company, it takes money to fight on behalf of the Russian forces. For the past few months, we have heard him constantly grumble and rumble that his men are being killed, that they are dying, they are being used as cannon fodder. You mentioned the Bakhmut, area where he was fighting, and he eventually won, but it took almost 10 months to be able to do that. It is true that Russia still has the control of almost, it managed to get a substantial chunk of Ukrainian territory. Even if you look at the 2% of territory that Ukraine was able to take back, Russia would still have at least around 14-15% of Ukrainian territory, and it wants to get more before it gets into any sort of a negotiation room, because it wants to be able to bargain from a hard position. Now, to be able to do that, of course, the role of Prigozhin is very important. His men, again, who are mercenaries, who are recruits that were brought in from different prisons, who were asked to, basically train for 6 months and then fight with the group itself. He has fought in some of the hardest conflict areas. He's very battle hardened, as we say it, in Syria, in Libya, in Mali, in the Central African Republic, of course, in Ukraine. he has been fighting for money. I refuse to believe that despite his popularity today, there are mixed signals, because Putin himself has been praising Prigozhin. Putin himself has been praising Wagner PMC. When the reports of this mutiny started to come in late Friday evening, played out through Saturday, of course, there were a lot of images coming in of his men going into, say, for instance, McDonald's to buy a burger. Mixing with the crowds, just sort of, and people actually being very comfortable with these men being around. Russians are not at a discomfort with them. So that's true that he's popular. But I don't think that this is a political popularity for him, or that he personally, has that kind of a political grip. He may have wanted to take control of Moscow. We don't know for sure as yet. I think the next few days will reveal a lot, because we are hearing a lot of narratives come out slowly as the hours go by and the days turn around. But if he had marched over to Moscow, he halted his march 200 kilometers ahead of Moscow. If he had taken control of Kremlin, would he have been able to actually lead the Kremlin? I think that's a big question. I don't see him as a political nationalist figure. He has been fighting for Russia for sure, but he has been doing this, of course, dominated by mercenary agendas, which is something we must not forget. He's a hardened criminal. The men in his unit, I'm talking about a Dmitry Utkin, who basically founded PMC, and then Prigozhin took it into a very large-scale operation, and Dmitry Utkin, who was leading the convoys. He's a neo-Nazi. There are reports pointing out to the fact that perhaps what he was interested in trying to get control of some of the nuclear warheads. This is a dangerous situation. And I don't think that for Prigozhin, also it threw up easy answers, because a lot of his heartburn, a lot of his anger is at the moment deflected towards the Russian defense minister, Shoigu, and the army chief. Because if you look back a few days, if you just rewind a few days back, there was this notification from the defense ministry that basically said that anybody, they didn't name Wagner, but they said that people would basically have to sign up with the government. So the private contracts would kind of come to end, which meant that the Wagner group would come to an end. This did not go down well with Prigozhin, who had already been complaining over the last few months that this was a war that was not going forward the way it should have been because of the leadership faults. So for Putin, I think where the problem for Putin lies is there are two things. One, yes, Prigozhin's men are accepted in Russian society. So to take the Russian society away from Prigozhin's men, and these are men who have fought alongside the Russian military. So, the estimate that Prigozhin puts out is that he has at least around 25,000 men. So, which means to understand that how many men in the Russian military units actually are today with Prigozhin, it's not an easy game. Did Putin manage this to try and weed out all the dissenting voices, all the ones who he thinks are traitors? Again, that's a theory that is far-fetched at the moment, because this posed a serious threat for him. And to be able to now go ahead, if on the one hand, if you look at his statements, Putin's statement, which came on TV for a couple of minutes, and he called these people Saturday morning that they are traitors, that they are criminals. But by evening, you are saying that all criminal charges are being dropped. In fact, his own, the MFA spokesperson, they have been saying that these people are actually of great heavy interest to Russian security and Russian society. They have been heaping praises on the Wagner group. So can Putin really go ahead into this war and not be weakened if the Wagner group has now been given a safe passage to Belarus, if the forces are parked there? The future of the Wagner group, whether they will still continue to deal with the Putin and the forces or not, that itself is very unclear. So there are great question marks there about what really happens moving forward here.
That's very good observation. And but the one question emerge. As you pointed out that by and large, Prigozhin is money-minded. By and large, he worked just because of for money, and he's not like a nationalist as the others figures. Yes, you are right in that sense, but you don't think so that Putin was not aware of this fact when he was sending Wagner's group to the in Syria war, and during the Syria war 2018, lots of sacrifices were there, and during that time, the Russian response was muted. So this kind of, when he was trying to know, he was trying to recruit, when he allowed to recruit criminals in the Wagner groups, even Putin was unaware. The second point, that when he was publicly making allegations on the defense minister, Sir Shoigu, and the final general chief of the army staff, Gerasimov, and so these are the incidents that were taking place last 4 5 months before. So Putin was unable. When we know that Putin is a very visionary leader, so Putin was unable that he might lead, he might change his intention and try to control the Kremlin. So I just want to ask, how can we believe that Putin was unaware the kind of intention and the kind of incident took place today under this backdrop?
I don't think that Putin would be unaware for the last many years. I mean, Putin is, at the end of the day, a very crafty leader. He himself has headed the KGB for years, and he has worked up the ranks of the KGB. So it's not really about misreading the intention of somebody like a Prigozhin. I think it's about taking calculated strategic risks, which Putin did. And it is a problem. I think this saga, the way it has unfolded, it has brought to the fore that every time you have this kind of a setup, when you have a private militia that is being built, even if it's in the name of fighting for the country, at the end of the day, sooner than later, it turns into a Frankenstein's monster. And people need to have clarity on that. On a very small scale, if you look at, there have been instances of agencies or of local police in conflict zones in India, be it in Kashmir, be it in Northeast, be it in the Naxal belts, the red corridors. I have done stories on that, where a lot of village councils or villagers were armed to take over the terrorists, to fight the insurgents. And a couple of years down the line, the sort of morality which was involved when this first began, that gets lost, that gets blurred, and more often than not, then the armed village outfits themselves become a headache for the agencies and for the authorities. So that's a smaller example to illustrate that when you have these kind of extrajudicial authorities that are created in the name of national security, it eventually will come back to bite you at some point in time. And the larger the scale, the larger, in fact, the dangers of the return on investment. Having said that, I think for Putin, look, in the last few years, Putin, of course, has faced internal challenges. And we have seen, series of reports on how his critiques have either been jailed, his political opponents, they have been thrown off buildings. Suddenly they've died. Doctors have said, oh, he wasn't feeling well. He was feeling dizzy. He just, somebody just feels dizzy and flies out of the window. That's been a common pattern for so many of deaths involving his critiques and opponents. So he is constantly strategizing, re-strategizing. He's a man who has gone into Georgia, who's had a Crimea annexation. The Donbass region, in fact, it's something that has faced a lot of military upheaval in the past too. That's when, in fact, first Prigozhin came and started in, and which is basically the Bakhmut area that we are talking about. So for Putin, now you see a report in the Washington Post which claims that there have been intelligence, information that has been there since possibly mid-June, with no clarity of an exact day of strike, that Prigozhin was up to something like this. So did Putin misread this? And we have to take all these reports that are coming in from an American perspective also with a pinch of salt, because they would want to show Putin in as weak a light as possible today, in the backdrop of this particular incident, to try and say that, look, he has lost his grip and, he's on a state of a continuous decline. He cannot carry on like that. So for Putin, I think it's a case of how many people do you weed out constantly And how many people do you not trust in this situation, which is so fluid? There have been questions over the last few years that his internal security has been infiltrated, that it's not the same as it used to be in the first 10, 15 years, that there are now people inside his close, in fact, circle who are opposed to him. So under that situation, I mean, Putin alone cannot fight the war in Ukraine. He himself cannot go into the war field and, tank up and gear up and do the fighting part of it. He needs others. And you do not create a Wagner group overnight. It takes time to build these kind of militias, to build these kind of, outfits that are going to fight for you. There are risks involved. I would like to believe that Putin was very well aware of the kind of risks that are involved in here, but perhaps either he did not misread the scale of this or the timing of this. So, and if you look at Prigozhin's statements, his statements over the last few months have mostly been targeting, of course, the Russian military, the Russian army leadership, not so much directly to Putin. So now that, he retreated within a few hours, he went in, a lot of people are also saying that this was basically for a protection of business interests, that following the June 10th Defense Ministry order, Prigozhin literally felt that he was being driven up the wall and he had to state something to ensure his own safety, the safety of his men, and to not get involved and get sucked in by the Russian government, especially the Russian military. So for Putin, whether it's a classic case of betrayal, whether it is a classic case of intelligence failure, it's perhaps got elements of both. But I don't think that he did not have an idea that at some point Prigozhin would turn around, or at some point this militia would be a very heavy risk. There are memes and jokes doing the round on WhatsApp. I'm sure you would have received a forward where they say that the CIA calls up Prigozhin and they say that we are offering you money, march on to Moscow, take control. And then Prigozhin actually calls back Putin and says that they are offering me this money and offering it half is upfront. So Putin says basically take half of it and then, then come into Russia with some vodka. These jokes aside, there are all kinds of conspiracy theories right now, but we have to remember that Putin hasn't survived for more than 2 decades in a country as difficult with as complex a background for no reason. He's a crafty man. I'm sure he has had an idea of what Prigozhin's been up to, but he must have had reasons for not being able to calculate the timing.
Yes, right observation. That yes, I also agree with you that Putin, must have some sense of observation, the kind of nature of militia and the private army. And I think the next question related from this same question. The next question is, because of that awareness, that a sense of just you mentioned that, and we know that being a KGB officer, KGB background, being an intelligence background, he managed. I think within 24 hours, he managed. He managed the crisis within 24 hours. But the question is that the deal that took place between Alexander Lukashenko, he was the leader that has tried to mediate and diffuse the tension between Putin and Prigozhin. So how do you think, is it the short term, this deal is going to be short term, a short term relief to the Putin, or what is the future of Prigozhin after this deal? Because he has been exiled to the Belarus.
Well, I wish I had concrete answers to any of this, or I was a fly on the wall when those conversations were happening between Lukashenko and Putin and, of course, Prigozhin. Unfortunately, I think a lot of us right now are shooting in the dark because the terms and conditions are not clearly known at this point in time. Some are even arguing that there was no negotiation really because, it wasn't about a negotiation. It was about protection of his immediate security and business interests. And so Prigozhin thought that this was smarter, that actually I don't know whether Putin is really going to give in with all these claims that are being made that, the Russian army chief and the defense minister should go. We'll get to know in a few days, because if they don't go, which means that it wasn't a negotiation, it was more of an appeal perhaps from Prigozhin that he wanted a way out. How strong does Prigozhin remain currently? We don't know whether, who will continue to pay this military unit. Whether the Russian state will actually continue to support his entire outfit comprising of some 25,000 men who have been fighting in very difficult, hardy terrains. Whether they will continue to do the payouts for the families for, of course, these men who have died, particularly in the Ukraine war, have been hailed as heroes by the Russian leadership to the Russian people. Alexander Lukashenko, of course, is a strong ally of Putin and one of the longest serving autocrats himself in Europe. Now his role, of course, has come to the fore too following this, but we will have to wait and watch here that if, on the one hand, having declared them as traitors, as people who have backstabbed, as people who basically have committed treason, if the Russian state does not take action against them, there will be mixed signaling. And I'm seeing some Russian commentators being quoted from inside Russia in a couple of the international outlets who seem to be disappointed with this fact, who seem to suggest that there is a contradiction, that you cannot in the morning make a statement and by evening just drop completely all the charges against a Prigozhin and let him go, to Eastern Europe, to leave Rostov as well. So that is going to be an area that we need to watch. The question of Prigozhin's survival. Is there an understanding between Putin that he stays on in Belarus, but his men continue to be integrated? And the third question is that, this is a time when Zelensky and the Ukrainian forces are planning for a spring offensive. So in the next few days, if the Wagner group is not fighting with the Russian forces and the Russian forces lose territory in any sort of a way, they suffer some defeats, it will lead to a lot of questions which have already been raised within the Russian domain. Much of it, of course, has been suppressed, just like the protests that we saw happening. They were quelled. No news was being allowed to come out to social media too over the last few months, last year in particular. These are areas I don't think that anybody has a specific answer to at this point in time, and we should not pretend like we know the answers. I definitely don't know. I will have to wait and watch to understand that whether the Russian forces can continue without the hardened mercenaries of the Wagner group or not. And if not, then are they willing for these forces to continue to be, in fact, fighting alongside the Russian forces, or will there be some sort of a back understanding to integrate them in quietly into the forces? Because, there were also reports that during this march to Moscow from Rostov, a couple of helicopters were downed, a couple of Russian pilots were shot at. Are these criminal offenses? Are these offenses that can be forgiven so easily in the name of claiming that, we wanted to prevent the bloodshed? So it is this fluid situation. You may not see a disintegration of Russia at this point in time. You may not see a civil war break out, but I think it presents a lot of challenges, perhaps, if Putin goes eventually, if Putin is forced to step down, it will perhaps not be because of a sudden civil war. It will be because of these polarizing sort of forces within his own teams and the kind of increasing inherent rivalry, the gangster style wars that we are seeing break out, that will add to the complexities here for Mr. Putin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Your deep insights on this very complex issues. And you are right that nobody can claim, nobody make predictions in that backdrop where the things remain unclear. Even let us see what will happen in the next couple of days. And I do hope, I believe that your interpretation, your insights will be highly, helpful, will be highly relevant for policymakers, for geopolitical analysis, and we should not go to analysis the entire issue black versus white. So Thank you so much for joining us. Mr.
I just want to, in conclusion, just want to flag that uh, unlike in 1991, when you had a Gorbachev and attempted coup, and then in the next 3-4 days, while the coup fails, but also in the 3-4 days, you see that there is a collapse. This is different because Putin does still manage to have that political sort of statecraft where he's controlling. But at the same time, in Russia, you never know what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
And keeping in mind their alliances, the people that have spoken to Putin directly, it's not a Prime Minister Modi, it's who has spoken to him despite our close trusted, relationships. It is basically the Turkish president, because obviously this is a problem right at his doorstep. It is the Iranians who spoke to the Russians. So that entire alliance, keeping in mind of Russia, Iran, China is still quiet. It hasn't given out statements, just like India, it's in a wait and watch mode. So I think there is a lot of tectonic shifts that are happening. There will be some changes for sure going forward in the next few months. Ahead of those presidential elections, there will be more challenges, I think, that Mr. Putin will face internally when it comes to the political ramifications of these kind of steps.
Yes, you are right that there will be certain tectonic shift in the coming couple of days. And as we know, in the geopolitics, especially in international politics, nothing is certain. And we will watch. And I hope that your interpretation, your nuanced analysis of this entire episode will be very, very helpful for all, especially the young scholars who are watching this entire Russian politics, Russian geopolitical crisis. And scholars like me who have been conducting research on Putin and the Russian foreign policy. So I do believe also that Putin was the leader. Putin is the leader who stabilized the country, and he was the leader who took forward the country as a superpower status. He was the leader who managed the Chechen rebels. So I hope that he will manage the entire episode, and your interpretation is also very, very important for all of us. Thank you so much for joining FGS podcast program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tripathi, for having me. Putin has managed the crisis. He hasn't resolved it. So thanks. I hope your scholars find my journalistic analysis useful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.